morning. Yeah. Welcome to the bucket courses. It's really great to see you all. The weather's much better this morning than it was 1 week ago. We're thankful for that. My name is Barb Lease. Janet is back from her warm place, but you'll still be seeing me up here sometimes, so I hope that's okay. That's Janet applauding. Now, here are some things you need to know before we start. Masks are welcome but not required. Please silence your cell phones. Turn on your tea coil if you have one. If there's time for questions, Judy and I will come around with the mics. Please speak directly into the mic. Coffee and cookies cost about $2. If you're able, please consider putting a little money in the big green bucket on the refreshment table. If you're able, please put your chair up after the program on the dollies. There's 2 in the back and there's 2 in the front here. And now for the main event. Professor ERIK Simpson is a professor of English at Grinnell College. His literature courses focus on British and Irish writing from Shakespeare to the present, especially the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. Today he will examine a number of key developments in the history of the book, including the industrialization of printing in the 19th century and the digitization of book production and distribution in recent decades. His course this morning is entitled The History and Future of the Book. Please join me in welcoming Professor ERIK Simpson.
I need to turn off my phone. Turn off the sound. Yeah, there we go. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Barb. And thanks to everyone who does all of the work I know is necessary to make this wonderful series possible. I'm so glad to have the invitation to be with you today. It's entirely possible, I've found, to think about books all the time without thinking about books very much. I declared my major in English literature more than 30 years ago, and I've been studying and teaching books ever since. What I mean by that, though, is that I studied the things that people wrote in books, the ideas represented on the page. Until recently, I only dabbled in paying attention to the form of the book itself. It may be surprising, it may not, that my new interest in the form of the book grew out of my interest in digital studies and electronic textuality. Thinking about texts outside of printed pages made me stop and say, well, wait a minute, what about those printed pages? What about the book as an object? What do we gain and lose as we move from print to digital forms of textuality? And that connection between print and digital textuality may seem odd, but I find it's common among humanities scholars today. The people investigating the history of the book are often the same people writing computer programs to think about textuality electronically. And that's why I find it helpful and exciting to think about the history and future of the book together, as we will today. I'll say it's going to be mostly history, but we'll point to the future a little bit at the end. So to start that process, I want first to try to undo the familiarity of the book, to stop seeing printed texts as just exchangeable commodities that hold information. And one way to defamiliarize the book and help us see it again involves understanding its history. So that, for instance, as we walk out into the book-holding part of this library, we see the books here not just as books, but as books of their time. Books mainly of the later 20th and 21st centuries, books that have their own characteristics of production and appearance and storage that are not universal or inevitable. For instance, if we went to a library centuries ago, first of all, it would not have been a public library the way that this is a public library. This kind of library is a 19th century innovation. But in the library of a medieval monastery, for example, or a university library, the books would most likely have been stored flat rather than vertically. Vertical storage is a later thing. Vertical storage raises all kinds of problems. Mostly, how do you keep the books from falling over? And that's a surprisingly complicated thing, or maybe it's not surprising. Those of us who have books probably have figured out a lot of odd little ways to keep them upright over the years. But it's a real problem. And they also would have been stored with the ends of the pages facing out, not in. So some people get really disconcerted by the idea of spines facing in, but this is what they would have looked like. The spines of books were not expected to convey information. Books were not bound in standard ways by publishers, so spines were hardwares. The analogy that I've heard that I really like is they were like door hinges. In fact, with a very similar function of holding things that swing around together. But like door hinges, they weren't meant to be looked at. They weren't meant to tell you anything. They were just there to hold the pages. So now one problem you probably anticipate now is, so how do you know which book is which? How do you find books? And first of all, that might not have been so much of a problem because very few people and institutions owned a whole lot of books. If you only have a few books, finding them isn't a problem. And you probably follow this principle yourself. If you have a small collection of books on a nightstand or on a desk for a project or something like that, you probably don't worry about ordering them or how to find them. The finding problem only comes into force when you have enough books to worry about losing them. These libraries did, however, develop another convention for larger collections. They would write the contents of a row of books on the end of the aisle. So you can see, there's not the writing here, but you can see where it would be. So you'd have information saying, in this aisle, the following books will be found. And often it's listed one by one, because the books are pretty big. But sometimes it would be more of a general description. And you're probably recognizing already that this part of their practice continues today. This you'll find outside in this library or in pretty much any library that you would go to now, the sense that you look at the end of the aisle for information about the books that are going to be contained within it. So by telling you these things, I hope I'm making your everyday experience of books, especially library books, newly strange and newly interesting. So as you see this library, I assume a familiar place to most or all of you, you can see the arrangement of the books as one historical choice among many, one that has certain advantages but not others, one that will likely change again, so that today's choices seem oddities of history. And as you see the signage at the end of the aisles, on the other hand, you'll see a connection to readers across the centuries who have used the same technique for finding and communicating the locations of their books. So I love the way that studying the history of the book creates both of those reactions. On the one hand, making what we do today seem really weird, and on the other hand, making what we do today seem a connection to histories of centuries of readers across and across many places. So today, we'll begin by talking about the nature of the book in general, and then doing a little more of that historicizing, concentrating on three key points in history. The Gutenberg invention of the movable type hand press, industrialization, and then digitization. And I do want to say that this will mainly be about the British and American histories of the book, because that's the area of my training. But there are many histories of the book globally. Okay. So I want to talk about the book itself. And for lots of people, I'm going to say that with 3 minutes before I came up here, Joan leaned over to me and said, "I hope you're not going to say that books are going away." Right? And that's a very common concern. So our awareness of the material book comes from worry that it's going away. We see this movement toward digital reading and writing, and many of us feel a contrary impulse to hold on to printed books, and to want young people to hold on to them especially. We isolate the kinds of bookishness that signal an attachment to the printed page specifically. The digital age has prompted so many people to start talking about the smell of books. I'm not sure that was true 200 years ago. I suspect not, especially not in an affectionate way. And some of this talk connects to what I see as a funny irony of book history. Many of our current concerns about digital information overload, distraction, and the allure of virtual worlds are part of long histories of expressions of concerns about books, about the same concerns about books. So for a few examples, Plato records the worry that writing itself is going to harm humanity by ruining our ability to remember things. In the 1st century of the Common Era, Seneca the Younger said that the multitude of books is a distraction. In the 12th century, the Chinese philosopher Zhu Qi said that the reason people today read sloppily is that there are a great many printed texts. In the 14th century, Petrarch fretted about accumulating too many books. Quote, "This is not nourishing the mind with literature, but killing and burying it with the weight of things." And when the modern novel ascended in the 18th century, British people worried that people would get so involved, so immersed in fictional worlds, that they would lose touch with the needs of everyday life. They worried, in other words, about the novel as a form of distracting virtual reality. I like having that context in mind when we talk about books today. More or less everything we worry about in the move away from printed books has a long tradition of people worrying about it as a problem of books themselves. So to consider further the meaning of books, I want to pause to think together about the meaning of the word book, and here I need your help. This is a 2021 paperback called The Book of Difficult Fruit. I haven't chosen it for any special reason of its content other than my brother gave it to me for Christmas. And I just called it a book, but if I hadn't done that, I think you would have called it a book too. And you wouldn't have thought about it. You would have seen this and just known, like, that's a book. Now, I'd like you to talk with a neighbor or two for a couple of minutes about why you think this is a book. Very specifically, what makes you see this thing and know that it's a book? Okay? This is not a trick question. It's going to be a very helpful starting point. So I can do this. Okay. So my mic is cutting out a little bit, but I'm going to stop. Go ahead, talk about that. I've got it. Yep. We'll come back in about 30 seconds. Oh, you decided to stop. That's fine. Okay, please share. What makes you know that this is a book? We've got microphones. Thank you, Monty.
When you were really, really small, maybe even within a day or two of when you were born, your parents, if you were fortunate enough, would bring this to you and say, this is a book. And we're going to read many of them in your lifetime. So we've just called it a book, just like this is a chair, or, you know, that's your shoes. This is a book.
Yeah, terrific. And the chair, you see that, you know, it's got a horizontal surface at roughly like the sitting height, and it's got something that you can lean back on. It's got supports. And so terrific. That's a great help. What kinds of things do we see in the book that are similar? I know there's a hand over here somewhere.
It looks like it has binding and pages.
Right. And by binding, you mean that one side is closed in a way that the other is not, and the pages appear at the opposite of that binding. Right? There's that hinge mechanism that we talked about. Terrific. What else?
It has a title and an author.
Uh-huh. And where do you see them? I mean, you may not be able to see here specifically, but you know.
Yeah.
Where?
Where? On the
Yeah.
cover.
Yeah, on the cover.
Okay.
That would not always have been true. But here, yeah, it's on the cover. There's the author, and this is conventional too, right? That the title is above the author. You know right away that this is not Kate Lebo, the book, written by the Book of Difficult Fruit. Yeah, everything is where you expect it to be. Same with the spine, which again would not have been in those medieval libraries. Sometimes they would have written that kind of information on the ends of the pages, right? Because that's what you saw. But in this case, we know it's a book because it's got those things where we expect them to be. Good. What else?
I was going to say the aspects of a book for adults are, a lot of them are the aspects of a book for child.
Sure.
Children.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just grabbed a couple of really good ones. This one's Read Dear Bunny. It's from England. And what a heartbreak it would be if you weren't sitting there with the kid on your lap, you know, or next to you reading a book. And kid wants to read it again and again. And
Right.
And it does have the name of the author, like that. It has the name of the title. So some of it is similar. Has pictures. I don't know if there are pictures inside that.
Right. And Jill, the picture you're painting there of two people, in this case a child and an adult, reading together, really gets at a lot of what we love about this form of the book. First of all, it can be shared. Two people can look at it at the same time. And that can be true of other forms of textuality, but not always. You always have control. You're talking about reading it again. You can always move forwards and backwards. You have a lot of control about that. We don't think about the details of that process much anymore, probably. But the fact that you can control your speed, move forwards and backwards, you can bookmark. We all do this, right? If you use your fingers as bookmarks, you're doing something that other forms of bookishness don't allow you to do. Are there other things that came up in your conversations that we haven't mentioned yet? Yeah. Yes.
The shape?
Yeah. It's a
Rectangle.
three-dimensional rectangle, right. I should know the word for that, but I don't. Yeah, it's a box. It's essentially a box. That's really important. There are books that have other shapes. I was just reading about a Victorian book that is kind of goes up like this, so it's kind of a double rhombus of some sort, and it's a children's book, and it's all about rushing downhill. So the shape of the book reflects the action of it. It's really fun, but generally three-dimensional rectangle. Yeah. There was a comment back there. Oh yes, Tom.
Emily pointed out that it wasn't a pamphlet. So, I mean, the distinction between a pamphlet and the book, she pointed that out. The title tells us it's a book. So that seems to help out a little.
Yeah. And generally, the distinction between a book and a pamphlet, which is trickier than might first appear, like how do you draw that line, but is that you have covers that are not part of the thing itself. So a pamphlet, usually the text begins on the cover. And in a book, the cover has a separate function. But that's not, if you looked at a pile of things, that wouldn't be universally reliable, I think. Okay, great. Let's get two more. I've seen two more hands here.
Well, this may not be germane, but Steve and I were talking about the word book. And you book a tour, or you book a hotel,
Yeah.
or if you're a gambler, there's also bookies, and the bookies, it's a numbers thing, really, but it's for gambling.
Yep.
And
And
so
in
there
every-
are other ways that that word is used and, understood.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And in every case, I think what that means, at least metaphorically, is you provide information that is set down in the book. So this isn't true at most hotels anymore, but there used to be a book. And if you booked a room, your information would be set down in the book. And the bookie is setting down your bets in their book. And so a lot of these indicate systems that used to have books at their center and now usually have spreadsheets or databases at their center. Yes, thank you for that. Yes.
I think you'll find that almost all of those books are the relationship of the sides is the golden ratio, 1 to 1.16, and they're all going to be within that.
At least more or less, yeah. They'll be in that neighborhood. Yeah, the rectangularness, the particular dimensions is really important. And also just the size. Like, this is kind of what books look like. You hold them. In the early print, the size of pages would be determined by the arm length of the people who made the paper. That's not so true anymore. Now you have A4 paper in England and 8.5 by 11 paper, and you have other kinds of sheets that get folded. But this is about what we expect. And you're right to point at these examples. They come from across a few centuries, coming from different places, different purposes, but they're all about the same size and about the same ratio, indeed. All right, excellent. So now we're going to start messing with this a little bit. Before we do, I want to come back to what Tom and Emily were saying. It says it's a book. It's the book of difficult fruit. And that's really important because when we get to the trickinesses of generic conventions, like what's a book and what's not, often the best answer, it's not at all a superficial or silly answer, is a book is the thing that says it's a book. And people say that, or people understand that message in various ways, but that is one of them. Okay. All right, so if I look this up on Amazon, just one step away from Monty's Googling it, I get the Book of Difficult Fruit, and it gives me 3 different ways to order it, none of which are this. One is the hardcover, and the first one is the audiobook, and the second one is the Kindle. All right, so we're going to take those first two, the audiobook and the Kindle. Are those books? Yes or no, support your answer. Janet. Janet. Yes, they're a book, and why?
Well, I happen to have read aloud one of those books that appears on Audible, and I read it right out of the book. And it was just me reading aloud as I used to read aloud to my children. Mm-hmm. I read exactly the text that came from the book, and so it seems like it's a form of a book.
I love that connection to reading to your children, because those of us who are sentimental about printed books are really going to be sentimental about the experience of parents or grandparents or loved ones reading to children. And children are experiencing them as audiobooks, for sure. And I think we're all going to agree that they've experienced the book in some kind of meaningful way. Yeah, okay, all right.
I have all 3 of those, not that particular book. Mm-hmm. But what I like about hardbacks or paperbacks is the tactile experience you have, turning the pages, flipping the corners, whatever, which you do not get with the audiobook or the Kindle. Yes, you can scroll, but it's not the same. And you don't get the smell of a book.
I do both the audio and hardcover, but I have noticed sometimes with certain books, like the audio book, like the autobiography of Carly Simon, the singer.
Mhm.
She was the one who was reading the book, and then she'd intersperse it with some of her songs. Where if I had gone and gotten the paperback or the hardcover, I wouldn't have had that experience. So I think sometimes with audiobooks too, there are different performers who take on the different characters of the book that bring the book to life, whereas the hardcover wouldn't have done that for me.
Great.
I think that the books that I like on the Kindle, for people who have a sight problem, it's a terrific because you can make the print to the size you can read.
Yes.
And you can't do that with you can get different books with different size, but this is for whoever wants to make it whatever they want it to be.
Absolutely. So this is a wonderful discussion, and what you're getting at in making different kinds of arguments and observations for the way that these different forms function is what in the biz we've started calling affordances, which means what do the different forms of books allow you to do, and what do they not allow you to do? And Jack, your example of changing the text size in a Kindle book is a terrific one. I know that a number of you, when you came in and picked up the handout on your chairs, noticed that the print is exceptionally small. And many of you were using instruments of magnification to read that, either that you had brought and carried separately, or the ones that you are currently wearing on your faces, as I am. So the Kindle book largely fixes that problem. And of course, there are whole long traditions of those kinds of affordances of different manners of books as well. I have my grandmother's Braille typewriter. She taught at a school for the blind, and she was creating other kinds of books that solved the same problem in a different way. And their audiobooks go way back as well. There are books on LP, at least from the 1930s and 40s, that are specifically marketed to helping people who aren't able to read printed books. So all of these have different affordances, different kinds. And what we're getting at here is yet another problem in the word book, in the way that we use it to mean different things. So first, it's the object. It's this thing made out of paper and boards and glue and stuff like that. And in this way, I think it's fairly easy to say that we don't think of the audiobook and the Kindle edition as books. So I do read Kindle books and audiobooks as well as print books. And I use this device to do all of that. And if I were reading a Kindle book and I dropped this and I said I dropped my book, that would sound weird, right? Same as if I were listening to an audiobook. That would be odd. And yet, we also use book to mean the words or even the ideas that a book contains. So if I say that I've liked a book, at this point, I don't even feel the need to specify in what format I read it, audiobook or Kindle book or paper or whatever. And it might come up, it might be relevant. I might say, there were songs in this edition of the audiobook and it was really cool to hear them, or something else that makes that difference matter. But to a large extent, we've always accepted that a book means the ideas in a book. So I'll say, by the way, my bio for this event says that I've written 2 books, which in a way is true. In a way is a statement that I don't understand. I don't know. There I am. And I mean that quite literally. Like, what does the word write mean in that sense? I certainly wasn't using a pen very often. What does the word I mean in that sense? What is the word? Yeah, it's very complicated. And the book itself is certainly not something that I made. I had nothing to do with it. I sent a computer file off and 6 months later got something in the mail. Okay, so we talked about this as a matter of affordances. Each of these forms is going to have things that it can do and things that it can't do, and they're going to change across those uses. And again, I'm going to find it helpful to historicize our forms in the context of others. So before the advent of printed books in the Gutenberg manner, there were technologies such as the Roman wax tablet and stylus. And this is a portable and reusable book format where you would use that pen-like thing, the stylus, to etch into the wax, and then you can clean it off like a in a hockey rink, and use it again. In that way, it really does anticipate something like an iPad in ways that even the printed book doesn't as much. So I like that example for that reason. This is a Khipu, Khipu, and it's an Andean form of bookishness. So it's used the Inca period and before that. And it's a form of myself again. There it is. Encoding information in knots. So the positions of those knots is encoding numerical or narrative information. So that's another kind of book. And this is one that more people think about more commonly, the scroll. It was widely used in Mediterranean, Egyptian, Roman civilizations. And as in this picture, it usually consisted of vertical pages read across the scroll. So I think there's a common scroll like this. That's generally not right. It's generally across, reading pages that look more like modern book pages than you might anticipate. And I like the example of the scroll because it's a good reminder that these forms generally don't disappear. They persist and they transform. So, of course, we still have paper scrolls of various kinds, but there are also other kinds of scrolls inscribed with information like cassette tapes and VHS tapes. Those are scroll technologies as well. And modern forms can expand our thinking in still more ways. I'm just going to share one of my favorites, which is a creation of Fiona Banner called Book 1 of 1. This is a printed object, but the printed content, I mean, this is a digital image of a printed object, but Banner's thing is a printed object. The printed content of the object is simply a 13-digit ISBN number. So what Banner is doing here is calling attention to one possible definition of the book in the era of global corporations. The book is created by its ISBN registration. This suggestion invites us to think about how books are made as consumer and administrative objects by reducing the book to its pure bureaucratic essence as a 13-digit number that can be entered into a database. Banner's work is an example of what's called an artist's book, a whole genre of works that explores the nature of books and makes us concentrate on them as physical objects, unlike most commercial books, which call attention to a book's consumer appeal relative to other books, but not to the materiality of how they're made and distributed and so on. So it's very difficult to articulate a consistent definition of a book in abstract terms. We define them situationally and based on convention and experience, with things like it tells us it's a book. But for most purposes, our informal uses work just fine. Okay, so I'm going to look a little bit at our first historical moment, and then I know we have a break time coming up. I promised Gutenberg's our first moment that we're going to stop on for a little bit. The form of the book that Gutenberg is working with is called a codex, and the plural is codices. And that's what we talked about with this. It was the the first thing we said about why we know this is a book, it's a pile of pages attached by a binding. This is a codex. The codex comes into wide use in the Roman Empire. It's largely associated with the rise of Christianity, and they usually contained handwriting before Johannes Gutenberg came along in the 1400s in Germany. His innovations set off an information revolution, and if you know one thing about Gutenberg, it might be that he printed an edition of the Bible, which is true, or that he invented movable type, which is sort of true. Movable type involves creating little metal shapes for each character of a language and then combining them to create a page of text, and then crucially recombining them to create another page of text. That's the movable part. So one set of type characters can produce any text in a language, and crucially can print multiple sheets that are nearly identical. So you would get your set of type and put it in a case like this one. And you can see there are little boxes for each character that you need to make. Each of those is called a sort. So you have a sort that contains all your small c's, for example. And to make your page, you extract all the characters you need from the sorts and put them in something that holds them together to make the page. You have to set them backwards. Kind of famously, you have to be able to do everything in reverse. And then when you're done with the page, you put all the pieces back. You have to redistribute them accurately. And the accuracy is crucial, of course, because otherwise you're going to start pulling out the wrong characters the next time you set a page. And I just want to note that some of our modern terminology comes from this process. So you see, the uppercase has the capital letters and the lowercase has the non-capital letters. That's why they're called uppercase and lowercase. And if you have a spill or you mess up the process of putting them back, they're out of sorts. Your type is out of sorts. So yeah, that's exactly the reaction I wanted. Thank you. So this is movable type. That's how it works. Movable type had existed in Asia before Gutenberg's lifetime. So we're saying that he kind of rediscovered it, or he independently discovered it. It's actually unclear whether he knew of the existence of other kinds of movable type before he made his version. But Gutenberg invented his method by combining movable type with other technologies of the time, such as agricultural screw presses and a new kind of oil-based ink. So he puts all of this together. That's really the genius of Gutenberg, is to take a bunch of contemporary technologies and combine them. And the result is the Gutenberg press. That's not Gutenberg. That's a nice man in Southern California. But the Gutenberg press involves setting the page of type, inking it up, and moving it under the large screw press to create an impression. And this is me operating a similar kind of press last summer. It was super fun, but it was fun because I didn't have to do it 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, like an early printer would have. So the spread and development of Gutenberg's methods became what we call the hand press era. And the ability to create print runs allowed printed books to reach many more people than manuscript works had. Okay, now the last thing before our break is I'm going to talk about folding for a second and the implications of folding. The prints that you make on this are on big sheets of paper, much bigger than a book would be. So to create the book, you fold the paper, you make it smaller. Your handout for the first half talks about this process a little bit. You don't need to absorb the handout right now. I'm going to make a point related to the handout by making a simple quarto sheet. Two folds. And now the problem is that they're attached at the top. Sometimes if you get books in old books in libraries, they'll still be attached like that. And if you call the librarian's attention to it, they might just give you a knife. Okay, so I've cut it. Now it's 8 pages. 2 folds creates 8 pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I made a book, by the way. There's a lot of, really, genuinely, a lot of information encoded in this thing already. But what I want to call your attention to is that when I unfold it, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4 on one side, and they're not all facing the same way. But I want to emphasize the non-1, 2, 3, 4 part of it. So one side is 1, 4, 5, 8. Okay? So those are the pages you would need to set to make your impression. You're going to print 1, 4, 5, and 8 at the same time. That has some interesting implications. First, it implies something about the skill of the typesetters. In terms of technique, type is really expensive, and you wouldn't have very much of it. So you're not going to set all 8 pages at the same time. You're going to set pages 1, 4, 5, and 8, which means you need to know where page 8 begins before you set all of the pages. And this is an incredible skill that these people develop, to know where each page is going to be set when their source text might be a manuscript or it might be a printed text in a completely different type size, page size, anything like that. They've got to be able to figure out where each page is going to begin. And they have some ways of fudging it a little bit. You can insert extra spaces and stuff like that, but a little bit. You've got to get it right or you're going to ruin your whole print run. The other implication is economic. That when you've printed half your book, you haven't printed half of the books. You've printed half of all the books. Okay? So when you start your print run, you need to decide how many you're making. And that's a big deal. And that explains, among other things, why Gutenberg made a Bible. Because if you want to know something's going to sell in medieval Europe, you make a Bible. And this has a big implication for the centuries that follow, that when we do literary history, when people like me do literary history, we tend to concentrate on what's new in any given period. Who were the living writers who produced new texts? But if you know that fact about print runs, you can infer pretty quickly that a lot of what was being printed were sure thing bestsellers from previous ages, such as the Bible, such as books of sermons, or later in the period, collections of Shakespeare's works, or collections later of Walter Scott's works. The things you knew people were going to buy and buy and buy and buy. So understanding just the very basic sense of how you laid out a page for a Gutenberg press helps you understand something about the reading culture of the next 400 years. That it's going to be a lot about these traditional books, these inherited books that you knew you could sell in a way that probably needs us to reconfigure our sense of who's reading what throughout that period. Period. It's time for a break.
We'll take a 10-minute break, so it'll be 10:55. Promptly. And now, once again, Professor Simpson.
Thank you. Oh, good, I'm on. Good. We've repositioned my broadcaster, and we'll see if that fixes the issue with the microphone. So now we're moving on to the second historical moment that I promised you, industrialization. And I'm taking advantage of our 10-minute break to hope that you don't notice that we're skipping a few centuries, because this session covers an awful lot of history in a short amount of time. That said, in terms of making books, there is some justification for that skip. There's a lot of continuity from Gutenberg's presses to 1800 to almost 400 years later. Of course, there were refinements to components of the process, but fundamentally, the hand setting of the elements of the page and the printing of each sheet remained fairly similar. In the early 19th century, however, there are a lot of major changes in a fairly short amount of time. So I'm going to try to capture the dynamism of that period by noting a few of them. The first is stereotyping. And that is going to create a nice transition out of the hand press era, because you'll remember from about 20 minutes ago that movable type changed the economics of book publishing by making it relatively cheap to create each copy of a book, but making it very expensive to set up a new print run. So if you printed 500 copies of a book and sold out, you might think you could sell 50 more, but it probably wouldn't be worth making 50 more because you had to do the whole setup all over again. There's no economy of scale there. Type was so expensive that you wouldn't have it just sitting around ready to print the same pages. In the early 19th century, the early 1800s, the technology called stereotyping solves that problem. And the idea of stereotyping is that you compose a page of a book, and instead of printing to paper, you print to plaster. And you make a mold of the page and then pour metal into the mold. And then you have a metal version of the page instead of a paper version of the page. And you free up your type to do other jobs. So this is what it looks, whoa, my goodness. Hold on. No. Oh, actually, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, got it. Okay, that's what a stereotype looks like. I also brought one, so you can pass it around and see. It looks like it's kind of heavy. Yeah. Okay. So once you make the stereotype edition of a book, you've always got it. It's ready for you to make even one more copy. I mean, it's probably not worth it to do one, but a small number would be fine because you're ready to go. Now, you may have anticipated this point. We get our common use of the word stereotype from this technology because if you have ideas set in your mind that are hard to change, they are like pages cast into metal. They're no longer easily movable. It's not movable type anymore. So this process creates a huge step toward what we would now think of as on-demand printing. It required a very large capital investment, much more even than Gutenberg. But once you've done it, you've got them ready to go. So these dynamics continue to boost the value of what we call those steady sellers, not the hot new book, but the Bible or Shakespeare or Walter Scott. Because you can have them on hand and you can control them. So big publishers like Harper's begin to publish in stereotype at the beginning of the 1800s, and by the end of the century, giant warehouses of stereotype plates ready to print new copies of their works. I have here a copy of the first book published in stereotype in the United States. So you get two guesses what it is. Bible is wrong, so it is Shakespeare. Yes. Where did I put my thing? Here it is. So here's the title page of it, and this is just a photo of this book. It's actually this book. And I'm going to enlarge Stereotyped by J. Howe in Philadelphia. And so it becomes an advertising thing. It's a cool new technology, and it's going to quickly transform printing in the 19th century. And we can pass this around too. With these older books, I ask you to be a little careful, but it's... Fun old book fact. You probably think of people working with rare books and manuscripts as wearing gloves. We don't do that anymore. Because it loses your grip, it causes more damage than it saves. So all rare book archives now say, wash your hands. That's the book safety measure. Okay. So stereotyping is the first of these early 1800s innovations. Another one is that machinery and automation are starting to take over the printing process itself. So you remember what hand presses looked like. And there were many kinds of hand presses, but by the middle of the 1800s, all of them are being used for proofs and things like that. They're not the main production presses anymore. So printing was transformed, like other industries, by steam power and then electrical power. So this is the Koenig steam-powered cylinder press that began to produce the London Times in 1814. In 1818, Koenig perfected a press that could handle both sides of a sheet. The quality wasn't good enough for finely detailed printing, but it worked well enough for newspapers. And the 1800s therefore see the emergence of mass news media in a totally new way. And by the end of the century, the end of the 1800s, machines like the Webb rotary press could handle long rolls of paper instead of sheets, and they could do the cutting and folding automatically as well. So when you've seen like newsreel footage of newspaper printing, you probably think of the papers being popped out as whole newspapers at the end. That's what becomes possible at the end of the 1800s with this kind of press. And in fact, today's biggest newspaper presses are essentially enlargements and refinements of that technology. So the Los Angeles Times also uses a rotary press. It's just warehouse size, and it handles rolls of paper that are 6 miles long. So all of this is specialized for newspaper printing, but all kinds of printing were moving toward large-scale automation, except for people who were self-consciously resisting that, like William Morris, who asserted the value of handwork and individuality in his press. So he has a design style that echoes that of early printed books. So this is a Victorian book. It absolutely could look more or less like a book printed today, but Morris is making design decisions that have a nostalgic reach backward instead. Another of these innovations in the early 18th century is a change of binding. The age of automation creates the kinds of books we're used to seeing today, both hardcover and paperback, because we start to have the development of standard publishers' bindings. So before this period, printers would make the block of text that would become the book, but binding could happen in lots of different ways. The printer themselves could bind some of the books. That did happen. But often they were passed on just as paper to the bookseller, and the bookseller might bind some of them kind of as display copies. They might say, if you want to spend this much, you get this binding, but if you want it fancier, you can spend this much, and so forth. And then you would choose the level of binding that you wanted. Or individual collectors could buy the paper version and then have the book bound according to the style of their own libraries. So those earlier bindings tended to rely on cords. Let's see. I'm just going to use my old analog pointer. These are the cords. They run across the spine of the book, and then this is actually part of the cord as well. They're attaching the spine to the covers. And that's what's underneath books that look like this. Okay, so you see the cord, right? That's what's happening. That's the machinery of those old kinds of books. But in the 1800s, we see the development of books that start to look more like the hardbacks we know today. So they come from the new technique of what's called case binding, which involves taking that whole text block and gluing it to the boards and end papers instead of attaching it like that. And in the 1830s, that combined with the perfection of cloth bindings, which are easily embossable, so you could start to have a standard set of a sense of what's going to be printed on the cover and the spine of the book. So therefore, in the middle of the 1800s, books go from looking like this to looking like this. These are embossed cloth bindings. And these covers particularly were selected for being especially attractive and cool. but the form becomes more or less universal, that you have the embossed cloth covering the paper, the boards that are glued to the paper. And today we don't see this look a lot because what we mainly see are dust jackets, right? The heavily designed attachment to the books. But if you take off the dust jacket, books still look a lot like this. Sometimes with designs printed in, sometimes even plainer, but it's still cloth glued to boards, and it has become absolutely standard. So that's the hardcover version. We also get paperbacks in the 1800s. They come a little bit later, toward the end of the century, and paper had been used to cover books for a long time, but not like covering them for real. It was a temporary way of covering them and protecting them from damage until you put the real binding on. In the late 1800s, we get designed paperback bindings. And so they're decorated and they're sold more cheaply than hardcover bindings. They're meant for relatively disposable books. And so they're sold to people who might not have been book collectors in an earlier era, people who weren't going to put as much money into their books, or people who wanted light reading, what we might now call summer reads or beach reads, that they didn't plan to keep for a long time. So many of those books were called dime novels, and that's calling attention to the price, like they cost a dime. Other books would have cost more. And I'm going to show you a couple of early examples, which again are pictures of books that I have here. So this one is from the Seaside Library, which is one of those late 1800s series that comes out. And I love this because that is not a leather cover. That is a decorated paper cover. It's just made to look like a leather satchel with straps. And that's emphasizing the portability of paperback books. The same way people now talk about the advantages of Kindle books having a kind of portability. That was the selling point of paperbacks at the end of the 1800s. And these are genuine dime novels. And you can see that they have The Case of Many Clues. It's a detective novel, or Sinner or Victim. It's a romance novel. Bertha M. Clay wrote lots and lots of books of that kind. And maybe I'll pick a couple of these to pass around. I'll give you John Halifax, Gentleman. Yeah, that'll be good. And then the paperback, so it is existing in the 1800s. It doesn't really take over until basically the 1940s. That's what we call the paperback revolution, where detective novels, romance novels, Harlequin starts at that point, science fiction, all start to become paperback-born modes with the same sense that they're being sold more cheaply to a wider audience. And then in the 20th century, eventually paperbacks start to become more sturdy and start to compete directly with hardcover books. And they start to fill the mall stores like B. Dalton's and Walden Books, and then the superstores like Borders and Barnes & Noble. And I'm going to use that as our transition to digitization, because for most of us, I think, if I start talking about Borders and Barnes & Noble, we are leaping on to Amazon. We know that that was the stage that set us up for the digitization of the book market in that sense. So the later 1900s and this century have seen ever-increasing shifts toward photographic and digital production of books. The typesetting is definitely not using bits of movable type anymore and isn't even using metal plates anymore, because Grinnell High School students and middle school students, and in many cases elementary students, can do a kind of typesetting on their computers that is far beyond anything that could have been professionally done 70 years ago. So you don't need that metal anymore. And this is our new kind of movable type. It's movable by the writer. It's sometimes movable even by the reader. So I want to take us into the digital age through a number of settings of the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, the now kind of iconic Gwendolyn Brooks poem, We Real Cool. That poem first appeared in print in Poetry magazine in 1959. I know you can't read this, it's okay. For the moment, I just want you to see what it looks like on the page. This is what a conventional poetry journal page looks like, and We Real Cool is the bottom half of it. It's a very short poem. It also appeared the next year in 1960 in Brooks's collection called The Bean Eaters from Harper's, again, huge publisher. And then 6 years later, it was published on its own as a poster by Broadside Press. And this is what it looked like in that form. Broadside Press was founded by Dudley Randall in 1965 to publish the major African American poetry of the day, including George Barlow's Gabriel in 1974. And I'm sure many of you know George. Taught at Grinnell College in my department for many years, or I taught in his department. But for the moment, I want to talk about Brooks's poem. So your handout for this half of our session has these two versions of Brooks's poem. The first from Poetry magazine, the second from Broadside Press. And I'd like you to take in just a minute to look at it on your own, and I'll ask you what you observe about the difference between these two settings of the poem. Whenever you have an observation you're inspired to share, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm still way back when we had to figure out whether a capital letter was an uppercase or not. Mm-hmm. And here we have all possibly uppercase.
Yeah?
When I first picked up the handout, I know this poem, but I hadn't seen the poster.
Yep.
I really like it on the poster. Mm-hmm. Somehow the form of the white on the black strikes you with the emotion, the sense of the poem, graphically. But on the book form, you see the shape of the poem better.
That's great. That's a lovely affordances point. Each of them is giving you something that the other one doesn't. Janet is secretly raising her hand.
So the one that you have on the screen right now looks like it was written by the pool players at the Golden Shovel, maybe painted on a in the subway or on a fence, or and it's not quite. I mean, it is printed and it is legible, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But the one on the other side looks like it was written by a poet.
Yeah.
And it's very polite, it's controlled, it's all the margins are right.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, wonderful. I love that these points about the emphasis that it is all capital letters, uppercase letters, although they wouldn't come from a case. because those are not standard letters. If you just look at all the S's, for example, you'll see the variety of them. So it is meant to reflect that sense of handwriting. And the lines aren't exactly straight, as you said. And that absolutely right, that it looks like it has been created to be outdoors in some way. The signs of paint at the edges. This is absolutely designed. And if you look closely, you can see that the poster version tells you who designed it. And it has all the kind of copyright information that Poetry Magazine would have, but it's a really different effect of design. It's design that is intended not to look designed in some ways. It's capturing an ethic of spontaneity and emphasis and voice that is quite different from what you're seeing in Poetry Magazine. Okay, so now, one thing I forgot as we were setting up is that this is the big moment of switching out of my presentation and onto the web, which I haven't set up yet. So I'm going to do a quick Google while you look further and talk with your neighbors about what you see on those two sites. So, time out.
Her, which we're doing, to use her personal money to go lobby for the church. And I've checked, she doesn't ever turn anything in, except when she Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So, oh, this isn't showing. It is pretty. Can I? All right, this is going to be a little tricky, but I'm going to be able to do it. All right. So this is the Poetry Magazine site, and one of the things that it does is it reproduces more or less the visual appearance of the original
poetry magazine setting, but it also allows you to do all kinds of multimedia stuff. So you can link to information about Brooks as a person and poet, and you can hit play and hear her reading the poem.
We real cool, the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon.
Isn't that interesting? And to me, it really starts to mess with my sense of whose voice this is in the poem, because we've just talked about how the two sides of our handout give us two different senses of voice. And now I think that's another one that I don't find completely compatible with either of the printed versions. And I love that. And part of what's happening is that we've gone from conventional mass market book publication to small market specialist activist book publication to multimedia republication. Okay? And so now I'm going to attempt to do one more version of this poem. I think I've got it.
I guess I'd better offer you We Real Cool. Most young people know me only by that one. I don't mean that I dislike it, but I would prefer it if the textbook compilers and the anthologists would assume that I've written a few other poems. I wrote it because I was passing by a pool hall in my community one afternoon during school time, and I saw therein a little bunch of boys, I say here in this poem 7, and they were shooting pool. But instead of asking myself, why aren't they in school? I asked myself, I wonder how they feel about themselves. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we learn late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we then gin, we jazz June, we die soon.
Okay. I do know what time it is. I'm going to be just a couple of minutes over because of my computer odyssey, but I promise I'm aware and we're getting there. So both of these digital representations of the poem, the Poetry Magazine one with the multimedia component and this YouTube video, allow it to connect to audio and video effects that would be impossible to achieve on the printed page. And you might also think that they lose something by shifting away from the printed page. Many people prefer the paper-based reading experience, that confrontation with the silent page. In fact, I would argue that this video itself captures some of our ambivalence about moving away from paper. On the one hand, obviously, it's gaining energy from its multimedia digital form. The music, the reproduction of Brooks's recorded voice, a different version of her reading the poem, by the way, and the interaction of the words and the images on the screen. On the other hand, the visuals are made of paper. Like, that's what it is. It's a paper project. And even within the paper, there are all kinds of writing and books throughout that video. It's just full of the ideas of printed textuality. So even the attachment to its visual style is so compelling because it's created by this hand-worked paper, and that sense of paper's tactility comes through in abundance in the video, even though you're not touching paper when you watch it. So I suspect that the future of the book, which we've been pointing at, will continue to reflect that ambivalence. Certainly many functions of reading and writing that used to be paper-based will continue to migrate to electronic forms. But I think we're already seeing paper and print take on a William Morris-like attachment to the past, as paper comes to represent a sort of handcrafted intimacy that separates itself from digital reproducibility and precision. These effects of digitization are economic as well. Most electronic books are controlled by corporations looking to prevent copying and sharing. The rental model of electronic books is especially challenging to the values of public libraries, for example. Therefore, paper is also coming to represent an attachment to another model of ownership, the sense of identity that comes with having a shelf of books in your house or a novel on the subway, or the sense of control involved in lending or giving a book to someone else, the way my brother gave me this one. Sharing and recirculation are becoming ever more difficult for electronic books. So this is a continuation of the economic changes we've seen from the beginning. Over the centuries, copies get easier and easier to produce. But the production becomes more and more about establishing the control of copying. For early printers, the capital was type. In the 19th century, it was those metal plates. Today, it's digital rights management, using legal and technical tools to create the kind of ownership structure that used to be enforced by the sheer difficulty of printing. In these and many other ways, we can think about the future of the book in terms of its history, seeing the trends and dangers and possibilities in community with the millennia of readers who've come before us. That's it. Thank you. One minute over.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Simpson, for being here today and giving us a new enlightened way to look at books and consider the question, what is a book? We look forward to seeing everyone next week, March 8th, for an historical look at agriculture through the expertise of Professor John Andelson of Grinnell College. Originally contemplated as 3 agricultural vignettes, Professor Andelson said that the first 2 vignettes quickly crowded out the 3rd vignette, so perhaps the 3rd vignette can become a bucket course someday, but we will have to see about that. So please join us next week for 2 agricultural vignettes and discover crucial connections between agriculture and social forces in history. Thank you so much for supporting the bucket courses.